Lena? I'm home. Lena, why is it so quiet in here? What's this envelope doing on the table? Petition for dissolution of marriage? Divorce?
A nervous laugh. No, this has to be some kind of joke. A phone vibrates. Mateo, check your email right now. Daniel, it's almost 6 in the morning. What are you talking about? Your wife just called an emergency board meeting at 2 a.m. That's impossible. She's just my wife. A long pause. Mateo, she's not just your wife. She's the woman who just took your company from you. He sinks into a chair. What did you say? You cheated all night, came home at dawn, and by sunrise, you lost everything. You're watching Afro-Korean Story Vault, where love, power, and revenge collide. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe and join the family. The early morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors. Mateo Cruz stood frozen in his custom Italian suit, the black envelope trembling in his hands. His mind refused to process the words printed in stark, legal typeface across the pages he held. This couldn't be real. Not Lena. Not his quiet, patient, beautiful Lena. He checked his Rolex, 5:47 in the morning. Just hours ago, he'd been in Ariana's bed at the Grand Meridian Hotel, her young body wrapped around his, her laughter echoing in his ears as he promised her the world. The same promises he'd made to a dozen women before her. The same lies that had become as natural to him as breathing. But he'd perfected this routine over 3 years. He always made it home before dawn. He always had his excuses ready. Emergency board meetings, investor crises from different time zones, technical failures that required his immediate attention. Lena never questioned him. She simply smiled that serene smile, poured his coffee exactly how he liked it, and asked about his day with those deep brown eyes that seemed to see everything and say nothing. Mateo walked through the penthouse calling her name, his voice growing more desperate with each unanswered echo. The kitchen where she usually prepared his breakfast was dark and cold. No aroma of African coffee beans she imported from Lagos. No classical music drifting from the speakers. No warmth. He climbed the floating staircase to their bedroom, his heart pounding against his ribs. The room was immaculate. Too immaculate. He rushed to her walk-in closet and threw open the doors. Empty. The designer dresses he'd bought her. Gone. But more importantly, the traditional African fabrics she treasured, the colorful Ankara prints, and elegant geels she wore to cultural events, all vanished. His hands shook as he opened drawer after drawer. Her jewelry box, empty. Her passport drawer, bare. The framed photographs of her family in Lagos that usually sat on her vanity disappeared. Even the small wooden sculpture of a Yoruba goddess that her father had given her on their wedding day was nowhere to be found. She hadn't left in anger. She'd left with surgical precision. Mateo stumbled back to the bedroom, and that's when he saw it. On his bedside table, next to his reading lamp, sat her wedding ring. The 5-carat diamond he'd presented to her 4 years ago at a lavish ceremony attended by Asia's elite caught the morning light, mocking him with its brilliance. Beneath it lay another envelope. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Mateo and Ariana entering the Grand Meridian. Mateo and a blonde woman he barely remembered at a restaurant in Tokyo. Mateo and another woman stepping into a private yacht. Each photo was time-stamped, dated, cataloged with meticulous detail. But it wasn't just photographs. There were bank statements showing wire transfers to luxury apartments, credit card receipts from jewelry stores, text message transcripts, hotel reservation confirmations, years of evidence, organized chronologically, building an irrefutable case of systematic infidelity. At the bottom of the pile was a single card with elegant handwriting. He recognized immediately. Lena's handwriting. I know everything. I've always known. And now, so does everyone else. Mateo's phone erupted with notifications. Emails, text messages, missed calls. His hands fumbled as he tried to unlock the screen, his password failing twice before his shaking fingers got it right. The first email made his blood run cold. Emergency board meeting called for 8 a.m. Attendance mandatory. Agenda: leadership transition and allegations of corporate misconduct. He scrolled frantically through his messages. 23 missed calls from Daniel. 14 from his lawyers. 7 from board members. Even his mother had called twice from Seoul. But nothing from Lena. Not a single message, call, or explanation. His phone rang again. Daniel. Tell me this is a mistake, Mateo said, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to warn you, Daniel replied, his tone heavy with something between pity and frustration. 6 months ago, when I saw Lena having lunch with Marcus Chen from the investment division. 3 months ago, when she started attending board meetings you didn't even know about. Last month, when she had private meetings with the Adeyemi Global Systems representatives. What are you talking about? Lena doesn't attend board meetings. She's not involved in the business. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. Mateo. When was the last time you actually asked your wife what she does with her time? The question hit him like a physical blow. He realized with creeping horror that he couldn't answer. He'd always assumed. Beautiful Lena, grateful for the life he'd provided, content to be Mrs. Cruz, happy to stand beside him at galas and smile for photographs. She's been consulting for Cruz Tech for 2 years. Daniel continued quietly. The AI integration project that saved us $40 million last quarter? That was her strategy. The expansion into the African markets that increased our revenue by 30%? Her connections? The patent applications that our competitors couldn't crack? Her innovations? Mateo felt the room spinning. That's impossible. I would have known. I would have signed off on it. You did sign off on it. You just never read the documents. You were too busy with your other commitments. The word dripped with contempt. Mateo, Lena isn't just some African woman you rescued from obscurity. She's Dr. Lena Adeyemi, Harvard-educated engineer, corporate lawyer, and the daughter of Chief Emmanuel Adeyemi. The name meant nothing to Mateo. His silence must have communicated as much. Chief Emmanuel Adeyemi founded Adeyemi Global Systems 30 years ago. It's one of the largest technology conglomerates in Africa. They have contracts with governments across 3 continents, and for the past 2 years, they've been Cruz Tech's largest private investor. The room tilted. Mateo gripped the edge of the dresser to steady himself. No, that's not right. Our investors are venture capital firms from Silicon Valley and Singapore. I negotiated those deals myself. You negotiated with firms that were quietly backed by Adeyemi Global Systems, the expansion capital that allowed us to open offices in Mumbai and Dubai, Lena's family money, the technology patents that gave us our competitive edge, developed in partnership with Adeyemi Research Labs, the merger deal with Kimtech that you've been celebrating for 6 months, brokered by Chief Adeyemi himself. Mateo's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the edge of the bed, the divorce papers scattered around him like accusations. Everything you thought you built, Daniel said softly. You built on her foundation, and now she's taking it back. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of frantic phone calls and mounting panic. Mateo's lawyers delivered the devastating news that the prenuptial agreement he'd forced Lena to sign contained clauses he'd never bothered to read. Infidelity voided his protections. More critically, the intellectual property agreements he'd signed over the years had granted Lena co-ownership of several key patents, including the revolutionary AI algorithm that was the backbone of Cruz Tech's competitive advantage. How is this possible? Mateo demanded, his voice rising to a shout. How did I sign away my own company? His lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Margaret Kim, looked at him with barely concealed disdain. Mr. Cruz, you signed what we presented to you. Mrs. Cruz's legal team was very thorough in their negotiations. At the time, you told us to give her whatever she wanted because, and I quote, "It doesn't matter what's in the prenup since I'll never cheat on her." The words came back to him like a ghost. He'd said that 4 years ago, intoxicated by Lena's beauty and intelligence, convinced that he'd finally found a woman worthy of the Cruz name. He'd made that promise. He'd meant it, too, in that moment. What happened? When did it become so easy to lie? When did Ariana's youth and eagerness become more appealing than Lena's quiet strength? When did he start seeing his wife as an accessory rather than a partner? At 7:45, Mateo arrived at Cruz Tech headquarters in downtown San Aurelio. The building that bore his name, the empire he'd spent 15 years building, suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Security guards he'd known for years wouldn't meet his eyes. Assistants scurried past without greeting him. The whispers followed him through the marble lobby like a shadow. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, he found himself face to face with Marcus Chen, the board member Daniel had mentioned. Marcus, who had always been deferential to Mateo, who had laughed at his jokes and praised his vision, now looked at him with cold professionalism. "The board is waiting for you in the main conference room," Marcus said. "Mrs. Cruz is already there." Mrs. Cruz, not Lena. The formality was deliberate. Mateo straightened his tie and walked down the corridor he'd walked 1,000 times before. But everything had changed. Through the glass walls of the conference room, he could see them. The entire board of directors. His board. And at the head of the table, in the chair that had always been his, sat Lena. She wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that he'd never seen before. Her natural hair, which she usually wore in elegant twists, was styled in a sophisticated updo. Her makeup was minimal but precise. She looked every inch the corporate executive, commanding the room with a quiet authority that made his chest tight. Next to her sat a distinguished older man in traditional Nigerian attire, his presence radiating power and wealth. Chief Emmanuel Adeyemi, Mateo realized. His father-in-law. A man he'd met exactly twice in 4 years of marriage, both times dismissing him as just another wealthy African businessman, never bothering to learn about his actual influence or empire. Mateo entered the room. All conversation ceased. 14 pairs of eyes turned toward him, but the only ones he could focus on were Lena's. Those deep brown eyes that had once looked at him with love now regarded him with something far more dangerous. Complete indifference. "Please sit down, Mr. Cruz," she said, her voice calm and professional. She didn't call him Mateo. She didn't call him her husband, just Mr. Cruz, as if he were any other employee facing a disciplinary hearing. He took a seat at the opposite end of the table, as far from her as the room allowed. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Lena stood, her movements graceful and controlled. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know this is unusual, but the circumstances require immediate action." She pressed a button on the remote in her hand, and the large screen behind her illuminated with the Cruz Tech logo. 4 years ago, I married Mateo Cruz. I came to this marriage with love, respect, and the full support of my family's resources. I believed in the vision he presented for this company. I believed in the partnership we could build together. Her voice remained steady, but Mateo could see the slight tension in her jaw. That belief was misplaced. The screen changed. Photographs appeared. Not the personal ones, from the envelope she'd left him, but professional surveillance images. Mateo entering hotels with various women, meeting with competitors while supposedly on business trips, using company resources to fund his affairs. For 3 years, I watched my husband betray not only our marriage vows, but also his fiduciary responsibilities to this company. He used corporate accounts to fund personal indiscretions. He shared privileged information with unauthorized individuals. He made strategic decisions based on personal relationships rather than business merit. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some wouldn't look at Mateo. Others stared at him with open hostility. However, Lena continued, this meeting is not about my personal grievances. It's about the future of Cruz Tech. Over the past 2 years, I have worked quietly within this organization to strengthen our market position, forge strategic partnerships, and develop innovative technologies. Many of you have worked with me directly on these initiatives. Heads nodded around the table. Mateo felt his reality crumbling further with each acknowledgement. The board is aware that Adeyemi Global Systems holds a significant equity position in Cruz Tech. What you may not know is that as of midnight last night, my family's company exercised its option to convert preferred shares to common stock, giving us majority voting rights. Mateo shot to his feet. That's impossible. I would have been notified. You were notified, Margaret Kim said quietly from her seat at the table. 3 months ago. The documents were in your weekly legal briefing packet. You signed the acknowledgement form without reading it. He had. He remembered now. He'd been rushing to meet Ariana for dinner. He'd scrawled his signature across a dozen documents while Margaret explained details he wasn't listening to. How many times had he done that? How many times had he signed away his power while distracted by his next conquest? As majority shareholder, Lena continued, and with the unanimous support of the board of directors, I am assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer of Cruz Tech International, effective immediately. The room erupted. Some board members applauded. Others began rapid discussions with their neighbors. Mateo stood frozen, his world collapsing around him in real time. Furthermore, Lena raised her voice slightly to quiet the room. A full audit of company finances and Mr. Cruz's use of corporate resources will be conducted. Depending on the findings, we may pursue legal action for misappropriation of funds and breach of fiduciary duty. You can't do this, Mateo said, his voice breaking. This is my company. I built this from nothing. For the first time since he'd entered the room, emotion flickered across Lena's face. She looked at him directly, and in her eyes, he saw not anger but something far worse. Disappointment. You built nothing from nothing, Mateo. You built everything from the privilege you were born into and the resources people like me provided. The difference is, I was willing to share that credit with you. I was willing to stand beside you as an equal partner. But you never saw me as an equal. You saw me as an ornament. A beautiful African woman who should be grateful you chose her. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. He'd never asked about her education, her achievements, her family's wealth and influence. He'd seen her beauty, her grace, her exotic appeal, and assumed she needed him to give her life meaning. I loved you, he whispered, and was horrified to feel tears burning his eyes. No, Lena said softly. You loved the idea of me. You loved having me on your arm at galas. You loved the way other men looked at you when I walked into a room. But you never loved me enough to be faithful. You never loved me enough to see me as a whole person with my own power and potential. She gathered her papers with precise movements. This meeting is adjourned. Mr. Cruz, you will receive a formal separation agreement from my attorneys within 24 hours. I suggest you retain independent legal counsel, as Margaret and her firm will now be representing Cruz Tech exclusively. His own lawyer. Even his lawyer had abandoned him. As the board members filed out, some offered Lena congratulations. Others welcomed Chief Adeyemi. shaking his hand with the respect due to a man of his stature. No one acknowledged Mateo. He'd become invisible in his own company. Finally, only Mateo, Lena, and her father remained in the conference room. Chief Adeyemi stood, his tall frame imposing even in his traditional agbada. "Mr. Cruz," he said, his voice deep and accented with the rhythms of Lagos, "when my daughter told me she wanted to marry you, I investigated you thoroughly. I saw a young man with ambition and drive. I saw potential. I also saw arrogance and entitlement, but I hoped that Lena's influence would temper those qualities." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong to hope. You took my daughter's love and used it as a shield while you indulged your worst impulses. You took my family's resources and claimed them as your own achievements. That ends today." "I never asked for your money," Mateo said desperately. "I never wanted to owe you anything." "You didn't have to ask," Chief Adeyemi replied. "That's how family works. When Lena married you, you became family. We invested in your success because it was her success. We opened doors because they were her doors too. But family requires loyalty, respect, and honor. You demonstrated none of these." He placed a hand on Lena's shoulder, pride evident in his expression. "My daughter has more business acumen in her smallest finger than you have in your entire body. She was running divisions of my company before she even graduated from Harvard. She could have taken over Adeyemi Global Systems, but she chose to build something new with you. She chose partnership over power. And you threw that gift away for cheap thrills with women whose names you probably don't even remember." The accusation hit home because it was true. Mateo couldn't remember half their names. Faces blurred together in his memory. Ariana was just the latest in a long line of meaningless encounters. "Lena," Mateo tried once more, his voice raw with desperation. "Please, we can fix this. I'll change. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't do this." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw in her eyes the ghost of the woman who had loved him. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone harder, stronger, forged in the fire of his betrayal. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she asked quietly. "It wasn't the cheating. It wasn't even the lies. It was the way you looked at me every time you came home from being with them. Like I was stupid. Like I didn't know. Like I was so grateful to be your wife that I would accept anything." She stepped closer to him, and he could smell the familiar scent of her perfume, a custom blend from Paris that mixed African oils with French flowers. "I knew about the first affair 3 months after our wedding. A woman named Sophie from the marketing department. You took her to Singapore and charged the trip to your corporate card. I found the receipt when I was organizing your office." Mateo's mind raced back. Sophie. Yes, he remembered her. Blonde, ambitious, lasted about 6 weeks before he got bored. "I could have divorced you then," Lena continued. "But I convinced myself it was a mistake, that you were adjusting to married life, that it would get better. So I waited, and I watched, and you did it again, and again, and again." "Why didn't you leave?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Because I'm my father's daughter. When someone wrongs you, you don't just walk away. You make sure they can never wrong you again. So I built my case, I collected evidence, I strengthened my position within your company until I was indispensable. I made myself so valuable to your board that when the time came to choose between us, they wouldn't hesitate." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "And I waited for you to make the mistake that would give me legal grounds to take everything. The prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause required proof of ongoing, systematic adultery. 1 affair could be forgiven. 2 might be overlooked. But 3 years of documented betrayal? That voided every protection you thought you had." Mateo felt sick. "You used me. I used you." Lena's voice rose for the first time, anger finally breaking through her controlled facade. I gave you 3 years of my life. I stood beside you at every event, smiled at every investor, supported every decision. I brought my family's money and connections to save your struggling expansion plans. I developed the technology that made cruise tech competitive in markets you couldn't even access. And while I was building your empire, you were in hotel rooms with women who wouldn't remember your name a week later. Tears streamed down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. You used me, Mateo. You used my body, my family, my brilliance, and my love. All I did was make sure that when this ended, I wouldn't be left with nothing but heartbreak. Chief Adeyemi moved to his daughter's side, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. We're done here. My lawyers will be in touch. They walked toward the door together, father and daughter, united in power and purpose. Mateo watched them go, watched his wife disappear from his life with the same quiet grace she'd brought to their marriage. Lena, he called out one last time. Did you ever really love me? She paused at the doorway, not turning around. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I loved who I thought you were. The man you pretended to be when you wanted to impress me. The partner you promised to be when you proposed. But that man doesn't exist. He never did. You're just a boy playing at being powerful, and I'm done pretending otherwise. Then she was gone, leaving Mateo alone in the conference room that used to be his kingdom. The next few days passed in a haze of legal meetings and public humiliation. The story broke across every business news outlet in Asia and Africa. CEO removed after systematic infidelity. Tech empire crumbles under scandal. African heiress takes control of husband's company. The headlines were brutal and unrelenting. Ariana called him once, panicked and crying, saying reporters were camping outside her apartment. He hung up on her. All his other mistresses seemed to have vanished into thin air, probably terrified of being named in the inevitable legal proceedings. His mother flew in from Seoul, her disappointment cutting deeper than any lawyer's accusations. She'd liked Lena, had welcomed her into their family despite some relatives' concerns about her African heritage. That girl was a prize, his mother said coldly. Beautiful, educated, wealthy in her own right. And you treated her like she was disposable. You shamed yourself and this family. Even his friends abandoned him. The invitations to exclusive clubs stopped coming. His calls went unreturned. In San Aurelio's elite circles, Lena's version of events had become the accepted truth, and Mateo Cruz was persona non grata. But the final humiliation came a week after the board meeting. Mateo received a call from his accountant, who delivered news that made his blood run cold. The penthouse apartment he'd been living in, the luxury cars in the garage, even the country club membership he'd enjoyed for years, all were owned not by him, but by a trust fund established by the Adeyemi family. I don't understand, Mateo said, his voice hollow. I bought that penthouse 5 years ago. Actually, sir, the down payment came from an account linked to Adeyemi Global Systems. The monthly payments have been automatically withdrawn from that same account. According to these records, you've never actually paid for the residence. One by one, his accountant revealed the truth. The yacht he thought he owned, leased through an Adeyemi subsidiary. His investment portfolio, seeded with Adeyemi Capital and managed by their financial advisors. Even his membership in the exclusive San Aurelio Golf Club had been sponsored by Chief Adeyemi. For 15 years, Mateo had believed he was a self-made billionaire, a tech genius who had conquered the business world through brilliance and hard work. The truth was more humbling. He'd been a moderately successful entrepreneur who'd married into real wealth and power, then mistaken his wife's family's resources for his own achievements. Everything he thought he'd built on her foundation, and now that foundation was gone. Mateo stood in the hotel room he'd been forced to rent after being locked out of the penthouse, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He'd lost weight. His expensive suits hung loose on his frame. The confidence that had always radiated from him had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell. His phone buzzed. Another message from his lawyer. The divorce settlement had been finalized. Lena was keeping everything: the company, the patents, the properties, the investments. Mateo would walk away with exactly what he'd brought to the marriage: his reputation, now in tatters, and a trust fund from his parents that suddenly seemed modest compared to the life he'd been living. There was one final meeting scheduled. Lena had requested to see him in person at the Cruz Tech offices, in what used to be his corner office. Mateo didn't want to go, didn't want to face her triumph in the space that had once been his domain. But his lawyer insisted it was necessary to finalize the paperwork. When he arrived at Cruz Tech, the building felt foreign. Security made him sign in as a visitor. He had to wear a guest badge. Employees he'd once commanded scurried past without acknowledgement. The company had moved on without him in a matter of days, as if his 15 years of leadership had been nothing more than a temporary phase. Lena's new assistant, a sharp young woman who regarded Mateo with barely concealed contempt, led him to the corner office. The space had been completely transformed. Where Mateo had favored minimalist Asian aesthetics with sleek surfaces and modern art, Lena had brought warmth and culture. African sculptures stood in alcoves. Colorful textiles hung on walls. The desk, still imposing, now felt welcoming rather than intimidating. And behind that desk sat Lena, every inch the CEO she'd always had the potential to be. "Thank you for coming," she said formally, gesturing to the chair across from her. The same chair where he used to sit while interviewing potential employees, deciding their fates with casual arrogance. Mateo sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to keep them from shaking. Lena slid a folder across the desk. "The final settlement agreement. Your lawyer has already reviewed it. I just need your signature." He opened the folder without reading it. What was the point? He'd already lost everything that mattered. "The penthouse," he said quietly. "The cars, the investments. That was all your family's money?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" For the first time, something like sympathy flickered across her face. "Would you have believed me?" "Mateo, you needed to see yourself as the provider, the powerful one, the man who had given me everything. Your ego required it. So I let you believe what you needed to believe. You made me look like a fool." "No," Lena said firmly. "You made yourself look like a fool. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your actions." Mateo signed the papers with trembling hands, his signature a shaky version of the bold scrawl it used to be. As he set down the pen, a question burned in his mind, one he had to ask even though he feared the answer. "Did you ever love me? Or was this always the plan?" Lena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. "I loved you desperately. When we met at that technology conference in Singapore, you were brilliant and charming and full of vision. You talked about changing the world, about building something meaningful. I saw in you a partner, someone who could match my ambition and intelligence. I thought we would build an empire together." She met his eyes, and he saw the ghost of that young woman who had believed in their future. "But you never saw me as a partner. You saw me as a trophy, a beautiful African woman who would make you look cosmopolitan and progressive. You loved what I represented, not who I was. And when you started cheating, I realized you never valued me at all. So you destroyed me. No, Mateo. I freed myself from you. There's a difference." She stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I would have given you the world if you'd been faithful. I would have shared my family's empire, built something extraordinary together. But you chose betrayal over partnership. You chose your ego over our marriage. These consequences are yours to own." Mateo stood on shaky legs, the signed papers in his hands feeling like an obituary for the life he'd thought was his. As he turned to leave, Lena spoke one last time. "For what it's worth, I hope you learn from this. I hope your next relationship is built on honesty and respect. I hope you discover that real power comes from partnership, not domination." He looked back at her, this woman he'd married and betrayed, who had been powerful enough to destroy him and merciful enough to let him walk away with his life, if not his pride. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything." "I know," she replied, "but sorry doesn't undo 3 years of betrayal. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you had something precious and you threw it away for nothing." As Mateo walked out of Cruz Tech for the last time, past employees who'd once hung on his every word, past the building that bore his name but was no longer his, he finally understood the magnitude of his loss. He hadn't just lost a company, or wealth, or status. He'd lost a woman who had loved him enough to bring her entire family's power to support his dreams, and he'd repaid that love with contempt and infidelity. 3 months later, Cruz Tech announced record profits under Lena's leadership. 6 months after that, she brokered a merger with a major European tech firm, expanding the company's global reach beyond anything Mateo had achieved. A year later, she appeared on the cover of Fortune magazine as one of the most influential tech CEOs in the world. Mateo saw these headlines from his small apartment in a less fashionable part of the city, where he was trying to rebuild his career from scratch. Some companies wouldn't touch him because of the scandal. Others offered positions far below what he'd once held, forcing him to start over at a level he thought he'd left behind a decade ago. He dated occasionally, but every woman he met was measured against Lena. None had her grace, her intelligence, her quiet strength. And he found that he couldn't lie anymore. The habit that had once come so easily now made him physically ill. He'd learned, at devastating cost, that some mistakes can never be undone. One evening, scrolling through business news on his tablet, he came across an interview with Lena. The interviewer asked her about the divorce, about taking over the company, about her dramatic rise to power. "People see the outcome and call it revenge," Lena said, her image poised and confident on the screen. "But it wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to accept less than I deserved. I spent 3 years loving a man who didn't value me, working for a company that didn't acknowledge my contributions, living in a world that saw me as an accessory rather than an equal." She smiled, and Mateo's heart ached at the familiar expression. "The day I filed for divorce wasn't the day I stopped loving him. That had happened long before. It was the day I remembered who I was before I met him. I was already powerful. I was already brilliant. I was already worthy. I just needed to remember that my worth wasn't tied to his validation." The interviewer asked one final question. "Do you regret marrying him?" Lena paused, considering. "I regret that it ended the way it did. I regret the pain. But I don't regret the lessons. He taught me that I don't need anyone to complete me. I taught myself that I'm strong enough to walk away from anything that doesn't serve me. Those are valuable lessons, even if they came at a high cost." Mateo closed the tablet, unable to watch anymore. She'd moved on. She'd thrived. And he was left with the bitter knowledge that he'd held greatness in his hands and let it slip away because he couldn't see its value until it was gone. He thought about the boy he'd been, born into privilege, raised to believe the world owed him everything. He thought about the man he'd become, arrogant and entitled, mistaking luck for skill and support for weakness. And he wondered if it was possible to become someone different, someone better, someone worthy of the second chance life rarely provides. But as he sat alone in his modest apartment, surrounded by the ruins of his former empire, Mateo Cruz understood a truth that came too late. You can't build greatness on someone else's foundation without honoring the architect. You can't love someone and betray them simultaneously. And you can't mistake being given everything for earning anything. He'd learned that lesson. He'd learned it the hardest way possible. But at least he'd learned. And somewhere across the city, in the penthouse that had never really been his, Lena Adeyemi stood on the balcony overlooking San Aurelio's glittering skyline. Her city now, her empire, her future, unfolding before her with limitless possibility. She didn't think about Mateo anymore, except as a chapter in her story that had closed. She was too busy building the next chapter, the one where she wrote her own destiny without compromise or apology. The African queen had reclaimed her throne, and this time, she would never surrender it to anyone. This is Afro-Korean Story Vault, where betrayal meets consequences. If you love this story, subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments, was Lena justified? Or did Mateo learn the hard way? Hit that subscribe button and join our family for more stories where love, power, and revenge collide.